story of Don McLean and American Pie. In 1972, one of the biggest songs in the world was American Pie by Don McLean, a singer-songwriter who was having a really hard time getting himself noticed among the really hard-hitting talent that he was up against during that era. He was 24 years old, frustrated, and thinking about how much the music industry and the world had changed over the course of the 60s, specifically since the day the music died. The tragic day in 1959 when Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper were all killed in a plane crash when they were flying to a gig in the middle of a winter storm.
We interrupt this program for a special news bulletin. 3 young singers who soared to the heights of show business on the current rock and roll craze were killed today in the crash of a light plane in an Iowa snow flurry.
He was inspired to write the song, but this wasn't just going to be any folk song. This was going to be some of the most stunning poetic lyricism of any song to date. So he came up with American Pie, an 8-minute and 36-second epic of a song that details the rise and fall of the 60s in literary detail. I'm Vanessa. Welcome to the Raised by Hippies YouTube channel. If you like my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into the song. Some of the metaphors are more obvious than others. Don McLean himself has never really gotten into the specific meanings of the verses. When he was asked about it, I can't remember what he said specifically, but it was something like, "It means I never have to work again."
Buddy was somebody that I communed with. All of a sudden, I opened the papers and he'd been killed. I was really in shock. And I went to school and I said, "Did you see?" He didn't even care. They'd moved on. Buddy was famous in 57. This is 59. He was pretty much off the charts. That's why he did that tour. Took the tour, killed him. Everywhere I'd go, he would be in the back of my head, and a feeling that I would get emotional listening.
First of all, the song is autobiographical in a lot of ways. It begins with a story from his youth, the true story of him being a 13-year-old boy delivering newspapers to the neighborhood when he reads a headline about a plane crash and the deaths of 3 of his favorite musicians. He reflects on the effect that learning such news had on him, and he compares it to the effect that the tragedy had on all of culture. He moves in and out, sometimes talking about very personal details, and then relating them to the transformations that were happening across society. Each verse follows a thread through history, beginning where the beginning of rock and roll began, in the church. Did you write the book of love, and do you have faith in God above? And just like in reality in the mid-20th century, something rivaled religion as what was publicly the most important thing in the lives of teenagers, rock and roll. And it was almost banned more than one time in more than one way for its threatening nature.
Rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today. Why I believe that is because I know how it feels when you sing it. I know what it does to you. And I know the evil feeling that you feel when you sing it.
The song is soaked in the innocence and idealism of youth, a lonely teenage bronc buck who likes to kick off his shoes and dance to rhythm and blues. But then things change. They become darker and more ominous. For 10 years, we've been on our own. It's like the beginning of an adventure novel. And it's here that McLean makes the first of many cryptic analogies, commenting on the sequence of events that led them to the disillusioned state that they now found themselves in. The jester sang for the king and queen in a coat he borrowed from James Dean. Most people agree that this is a reference to Bob Dylan, a self-proclaimed jester, whose style and demeanor was reminiscent of, if not directly taken off of, the character that James Dean had invented for himself as a young, rebellious representative of a generation. In the next verse, the king looks down and the jester steals his crown, often thought to be a reference to Elvis Presley, and how his top spot as the king of rock and roll was unceremoniously taken from him when people like Dylan came along. There's also a theory that the second verse could be pointing to JFK and Jackie Kennedy, and in this case, the jester would be Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin for whom no verdict was returned. He was killed before it got a chance. The quartet practicing in the park, that's clearly the Beatles. The name Lenin, the Russian revolutionary, is interchangeable with Lenin, who in the 60s would have been reading Marx, learning about communism, and increasingly becoming more left as the 60s went on. The following verse began with those foreboding words that Paul McCartney invented, which were later accosted by Charles Manson and his gang of murderers. We know what that's all about. Then he mentions the birds flying off, a reference to the band The Byrds, and their 1966 hit 8 Miles High. The jester returns to the story now, but he's on the sidelines in a cast like Bob Dylan was during this period after his 1966 motorcycle crash that almost killed him and caused him to retire from the music industry for years. The Beatles have also returned at this point, but now they're sergeants. They lead the charge in the summer of love, refusing to yield.
I really wish the people that look with anger at the weirdos, at the happenings, at the psychedelic freakout, would, instead of just looking with anger, just look with nothing, with no feeling, you know, because they really don't realize that what these people are talking about is something that they really want themselves. It's something that everyone wants. And it's dead straight. It's a real sort of basic pleasure for everyone, but it looks weird from the outside.
Do you recall what was revealed the day the music died? He asks, in what is believed to be a reference to the realization that a lot of people in the 60s came to, that the establishment that they were raised to believe in could no longer be trusted. The police brutality of the Democratic conventions could be the specific event that McLean is pointing to here, but it's more likely that he's referring to the overall loss of faith that the youth had in the authority at the time, something that would never really be regained.
The demonstrators did get into the lobby of the Hilton Hotel, and the National Guard was called. We do not see National Guard in this scene, so I assume that this film is even longer ago than the last videotape we saw. This was before, apparently, the National Guard was called.
In the following verse, we find ourselves in 1969, all in one place, lost in space. What I think is a reference to the gathering of 500,000 young people in the peak of the 1960s counterculture event, the Woodstock Music Festival.
By Friday, we realized that this show had grown from a projected 100,000 to maybe 5 times that number, with another million, we were told, on the way there.
You don't even have to bother bringing your tickets or anything, because they aren't going to collect them. There's no way they can. They got a fence that's like half up, and there are people just sitting in that field. It's really beautiful.
Then in comes Jack Flash, largely thought to be Mick Jagger, who made the catastrophic decision at the end of that year to hire members of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang as security at the Altamont Free concert in Los Angeles, which resulted in 4 people losing their lives.
Hey people, brothers and sisters, come on now. That means everybody just cool out.
The last verse is the most prolific. The little girl who sang the blues, Janis Joplin. She smiles and turns away, representative of only one of the many tragic deaths which would occur during a very short period of time. The sacred store, the record store, doesn't play music anymore, both figuratively and literally. Once upon a time, there were listening booths in record stores, where you could actually go in and listen to the music before you purchased it. All of these were gone now. And in the streets, the children screamed. This verse is about the reaction to the announcement of the end of the American involvement in the Vietnam War. Don McLean obviously wasn't aware at the point that he wrote this, that the war would actually go on for a few more years after his song was released. But he did remark on the collective feeling of grief and disappointment at the end of the conflict, and nobody wanted to talk about the national humility that came from that. And the 3 men he admired most, John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, and Martin Luther King Jr., all leaders of their time, cut down in violent and tragic ways. This verse is also significant because it brings the religion back into the song. Finally, what about the chorus? The one that we all know so well and can sing in unison like an Irish pub song. Bye bye, Miss American Pie. There was a rumor that American Pie was the name of the plane that Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper died in. This was in fact a myth. The line is a reference to American as apple pie. Bye bye to the simpler days. The Chevy is essential because it points to the American automotive culture that drove the industrial economy for decades. A levee is a man-made embankment built to keep water from overflowing into the wrong areas. The levee was dry. The water was out of control. Don McLean's song struck a chord with Americans who felt let down by the previous decade, who had maybe believed in the dream that things could be better, only to find that their efforts were lost, gone down in flames, with no time left to start again. American Pie is a sad, reflective story about the end of what some people think is an idyllic era in music and culture. It speaks to something that was symbolically lost the day the music died. The day that Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper fell from the sky like angels, unaware of the sequence of events that their decision to get on a plane would have for generations to come.